on home-based labor and workplace violence. Eileen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Yes. And it's a real delight to be here and to follow Susan's always stimulating and so beautifully crafted and researched work. So let me see if I can begin this slideshow. Okay, play from the start. Okay, and I am going to hide my you people so I can see my full screen. So this is a talk that I'm reflecting on what difference it made to do research on and not just be a academic ally and an engaged global citizen on issues of labor standards. And the photo you have here I was at the first conference of where the founding conference of the International Domestic Workers Network in Montevideo in October of 2013. And I'm with members of a group called NUDE, which was a national union of domestic workers from Trinidad, Tobago, and with the head of the Housewives Association in Uruguay, which was a bargaining group with domestic workers in that country. And so if I had a photo of myself in what I'm going to begin to talk about right now, I would have put there on here, but too many moves since I went to Ahmadabad in 1989. So let me begin with the personal. One day in March of 1989, I received an invitation to participate in an ILO meeting on home-based labor in Ahmadabad, India, the home of SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, a union of informal sector and own account rag pickers, garment sewers, embroiderers, and street traders. And now they also organize domestic workers. I had the opportunity to travel to where Gandhi had begun his march to the sea, the scene of more recent caste and religious-based violence, I later learned. Along with other scholars, experts from all over the world, I considered definitions and types of homework, organizing strategies, occupational health, legal context, and macro and microeconomic trends. During the final discussion on future research, each of us pledged to take further action after returning home. I announced that as a historian of the United States, I didn't have to seek funding from the ILO, but I could advance awareness of the emerging campaign for an international convention on home-based workers. I would be able to organize a session at the 4th International Conference on Women's Studies that was to be held at Hunter College in New York City the next year. I could also edit a collection of to disseminate our findings. Well, my listeners, I did that. And with political scientist Elizabeth Prugo, who is now at the Geneva Graduate Institute, who was then a PhD student, we co-edited Homeworkers in Global Perspective, Invisible No More in 1996, with essays from many participants at the 1989 and subsequent meetings of researchers that occurred prior to the passage of ILO Convention 177 on home-based labor in 1996. Reflecting the transnational network of homework campaigners, essays highlighted conditions in Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, Finland, the Philippines, Iran, Pakistan, India, Canada, the US, and Great Britain. In the early 1990s, I remained an active in active communication with feminist campaigners in India, Australia, and Britain, and followed what I thought was their steadfast progress and victory. But if you had asked me 20 years later, I would have been an unreliable narrator. I did not recall what I had pledged at the end of that meeting, though I knew I had organized a panel and had edited the collection. It took going to the ILO archives in Geneva and calling up the folder on that workshop to read about what each researcher had said back in 1989 to consider the full extent of the meeting and my participation in it. Memory is not enough. The historical record has many surprises for those of us who turn to the archives after participating in a social movement, or in this case, global campaigns for labor standards. I had only a partial view of how the ILO develops back in 1989 or 90 and passes conventions when I became part of this network of feminist researchers on home-based labor. It took going to the archives to gain a broader comprehension about how and not only why Convention 177 came about and who were the players that facilitated that victory. By the time that the ILO passed Convention 190, Violence and Harassment Convention, and this is a photograph of members of the Domestic Worker Federation in Geneva arguing for that convention in 2018 during the first deliberations. By the time that convention passed in 2019, I had been researching the ILO for around a decade. I knew how it operated. But until I was able to reconstruct the long road to this convention, I saw the struggle through the eyes of the domestic worker activists and advocates with whom I was both in solidarity with and linked to through the research network on domestic work that had emerged from the passage of Convention 189 in 2011 on domestic work. In both cases, my participatory connections obstructed a more fulsome understanding by elevating feminist campaigners in the first instance and domestic workers in the second. I had not given proper credit or downplayed other factors. Through these examples today, I hope to raise questions about writing ILO histories, feminist labor history, and the dialectic of past and present. So digging into the archives, I saw a focus on the feminist campaigners distorted the making of Convention 177. The shift from outwork as an evil to be eradicated, with family use of children as one of those loopholes, to home-based work and home workers as deserving decent work, could not have happened without the campaigners alone. And of course, as Susan just mentioned, not all feminist trade unionists thought homework was an unmitigated evil. That was particularly a position in the United States by both trade union and feminist allies, but not everywhere in the world. And in France, homeworkers, as Maria, who's in the audience today, have shown with Jean Beauvoir as an organizer. In any case, organized workers, I learned, shift their position towards what Western nations called industrial homework, and what the women campaigners and some from the global South refer to as home-based labor from an understanding of its more myriad forms, such as self-employment and on-account work. Both groups were faced with global supply chains and the challenge of maintaining international labor federations and jobs everywhere. The 1980s recognition of home-based labor as worthy of standard setting drew upon key players within and around the ILO, international union federations, and the ILO Tripartite Committee for the Clothing Industry, abetted by the staff on the program of rural women. Given the structure of the ILO, as you know, NGOs could only become observers with limited participation. And so it was really crucial that the workers were on board for any of these kinds of conventions, because the employers by the late 1980s and 1990s were not particularly interested in these conventions in standard setting, and governments were split. So it really was the success depended on the willingness of global trade secretariats and worker delegates to embrace the cause, though office staff played a crucial for an insider-outsider strategy. And the opening up of the ILO to questions of the informal sector and the problem of multinational enterprises further set the stage for their efforts. Well, here individuals mattered, and here's two of them. Most significant was Dan Gallon, the progressive head of the IUF, the International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, Restaurant, Catering, Tobacco, and Allied Workers Associations. And here is Renata Jabala of SEWA, who was one of the, who's now the leader after Elabad has stepped down, the founder. Gallon championed the notion of pressure from below, a form of bottom-up power that sought to heighten the stakes for employers from rejecting worker demands. And the IUF had a distinguished record of solidarity with what was called at that time Third World labor. And it did and continues to fight violations of freedom of association, then under apartheid, and coordinated interventions against abusive multinational corporations. And it valued the ILO for, as Gallon put it, its propagandistic effect and the repeated stressing of universality of fundamental trade union and human rights. The SEWA became part of the IUF through its beady making and tobacco arm. And I was told in interviews with an email correspondence with both of these, that sitting in the IUF Geneva headquarters in 1988, Renata and Daniel strategized the best ways for advancing protection on home-based workers through the ILO. He suggested that the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the ICFTU, now the FTU, would be the vehicle to push for something, hopefully a convention, but some sort of instrument. And with Renata listing talking points, Gallon drafted a resolution which reflected the standpoint of home workers themselves. So that's what SEWA brought to this conversation, who wanted their conditions improved rather than their jobs abolished. The resolution noted the significance of home-based labor for working people everywhere, including its spread within industrialized nations from deregulation and computerization. Exploitation and the lack of social protection came in its wake. Statements at other gatherings had assumed family labor as the factor limiting women's employment options to the home. This resolution moved the problem from women, that is, women can't go out to work or women don't have childcare, all of which was recognized, to larger structures and called for rights. It underscored a workforce of women disadvantaged from their, it was put, weak position on the labor market and the lack of possibilities to combine regular work with family responsibilities. Then Gallon set about gaining the support of the IUF affiliates and the ICFTU itself. Ella Bott, the founder of SEWA, was another key player, and I'll show you an image of her in a moment, who shaped the convention in committee as a worker representative. So I began to plunge into the records and the conventions of the international labor federations, as well as the ILO tripartite sectorial committees for clothing and related industries. I didn't find a smoking gun, but I could trace the shifts in strategy amidst changing political economies. And here my previous research on the history of industrial homework and the position of trade unions in the US was helpful, but the US in many ways was an outlier in its solid opposition to homework. And so I went to the meeting in Ahmedabad with this US-based understanding that homework was an evil and it had to be abolished, but with also a feminist understanding that it was the best of bad choices for many women workers. And so the conditions had to be improved. And it was really through these conversations with other activists, but also by delving into the archives, I could reconstruct a much more complicated history with these multi-actors. And I don't have much time because I want to get to the other case studies, but just to point out here, in 1964, when there's the first tripartite meeting for the clothing industry, in which the US unions were one of the groups pushing for, the attitude was homework tends to aggravate instability of production and employment. It should disappear. But there was the recognition from 64 that since some countries could not immediately abolish it, there should be a maximum governmental regulation and control. And the idea was, well, if employers had to pay the same rates and have the same conditions, then it wouldn't be profitable. So work would go back into factories. The push was the ILO should study the problem. And the trade unions really took command of the issue. The problem was a reaction post-World War II to offshoring and outsourcing from Europe and the United States to other areas of the world. And the International Textile, Garments and Leather Workers Federation, which founded in the 1960s, was a reaction to really the shrinking of garment worker unions in some places of the world, and they're struggling for growth in others. And again, the emphasis initially in the early 70s was to level the playing field. But throughout the proceedings and correspondence and such, there was this discourse of disgust and outrage, of evil and pity, and the presentation of the home worker as people chained, children trapped, near slavery. And yet at the same time, there was a recognition that you had to organize the self-employed. And so over the years, there is a shift from abolition to accommodation when it comes to home-based labor. And there's a number of unions throughout the world, the Canadians, the Argentinians, the UK, and other places that began to think we need to organize these workers. Others, like the Belgian Confederation of Christian Trade Unions, never relented in its belief that homework was a permanent form of blackmail to reduce union claims. And here, in places like the UK and the Netherlands, you really see the impact of feminists within the labor movement. Okay, what I did in my book, I traced the 1980s meetings of tripartite committees and the way in which they went back and forth. And by the end of the 80s, though the employers thought that homework was a legitimate, necessary feature of the clothing industry, the trade unions were beginning to push the ILO for action. Not only a comprehensive study, but a tripartite meeting of experts on homework. At the same time, the ILO discovered the new putting out system. And there you have the program on rural women, which discovers SEWA, or is involved, and then gets involved in supporting them, and partners with rural women's organizations in many areas of Asia in particular, lesser with Latin America, and supports such studies. And Maria Mies is the lace makers of Nassapa. and Zarina Bedi's Economic Role and Status of Women of beauty industry. And here's two of the women from the program and the women from SEWA. And so they developed a broader understanding of home-based labor and pushed within the ILO for action for research as a basis for standard setting. And this took, when you think about it, the convention was 1996, and this began, they really began their work in the late 70s. You get a sense of the long and bureaucratic process that was involved with getting a convention, that it didn't begin in 1989 was really so much preparatory work had happened before that to even get that 1989 meeting of experts in Ahmedabad that I attended that was just one in the midpoint of a long campaign. And so the support of the IUF, the ICFTU, ILO feminists, British and Dutch unions, and women campaigners were all essential. And direct appeals were also important. That Francis Blanchard, who was the Director General in 1987, went on a trip to India and met Ella Bhatt, and he was so impressed, and the various then appeals to him also made an impact, as did the various union resolutions. Okay, I'm going to turn then more briefly to about Convention 190, which actually this week came into effect. It came into effect yesterday with 6 ratifications, and the ILO has a whole series of seminars and conferences and press briefings this whole week to highlight a continuing campaign for ratification. Well, Convention 190 passed in time, not in time for me to briefly include it in Making the Woman Worker, but not in time to gain any access to 1990s internal records. So I went to the archives finally in August of 2019 for that. And I was well aware of the activism of the International Domestic Worker Federation. And at the second Congress in Cape Town, the fall before in 2018, which I was able to attend as a note taker and an ally again, I witnessed not only the resolve to fight gender violence and sexual harassment at work, but expand the boundaries in that battle to include domestic violence, the journey to work, and other conditions affecting employment. Still, it took discussions with trade unionists after I gave the first draft of a forthcoming article to highlight the centrality of trade union women beyond the Domestic Worker Federation that some of these same trade unionists had helped to birth. Women like Barbara Boudin of the IUF, who had been the gender officer for many years. I workshopped my paper first in Sweden at a conference on the long history of gender violence in the workplace and among labor historians in the US. And that pushed me to look deeper into the unions, which were there in my initial work, but I saw as the women in the global labor federations and in the global labor unions also just absolutely essential for building that momentum from below, and that could directly go into ILO committees because of the position of the trade unions within the tripartitism. So yes, there was a lot of grounds up activism, and I was quite aware of that. And from research on domestic workers, these newsletters come actually from the Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, which has a scattered collection of this kind of ephemeral material. And worker centers emerged as one arena that domestic workers and other workers, migrant workers, use to fight back against such things as violence. But in but really both insider deliberations within trade unions and within the ILO, again, proved quite important, an interplay between inside and outside groups. And the Women's Committee of the ICFTU, later the IFTU, really emerged as quite central to these efforts. That in 1985, when the ILO had its first resolution that mentioned sexual harassment, it came out of a committee that was putting together a statement that would be the ILO's contribution to the UN women's meeting in Nairobi in 1985. And the Belgian Marcel de Haring, who was head of the ICFTU Women's Bureau, was actually the secretary to the workers group during these ILO discussions about men and women in the world of work at that time. And even before that, the ICFTU Women's Committee underscored the fight against sexual harassment, advising that unions should encourage women to report instances of sexual harassment and negotiate sexual harassment clauses in collective agreements. And it raised the issue at its regional meetings and recommended that unions treat the problem like all other by establishing clear policies. And so they get the resolution, the inclusion in 1985 in the ILO's statement for Nairobi. And then they use that resolution on equal treatment for their own actions. The Women's Bureau widely distributes a guide based on the practices of its affiliates in the late 1980s. Within months, it issued reprints in English, French, and German editions, and produced additional translations in Thai, Portuguese, and Japanese. They got unions and political parties and governments and universities and journalists, lawyers, and the ILO itself requesting copies. And so the Women's Committee built a constituency to press for action. Shortly afterwards came a special issue of Women at Work. When I say no, I mean no, the bulletin of the Women's Committee of the IUF. And here that, again, the issue was there in the late 1980s. And yet again, it took decades to emerge as an ILO convention. So you have to ask, how did that happen? And it was really going back into the internal debates within the ILO on one hand, and on the other hand, really tracing the building of momentum of women in the trade union movements throughout the 1990s and the first decades of the 21st century. And I don't have the time to go into all of this now, but I could highlight, again, we see the Australians, the Canadians, the women's bureaus of the international, but groups like the Red Flag Women's Movement of Sri Lanka, which campaigned from the outside pressuring the trade unions. I was also able to trace a much longer ILO genealogy that appeared in a number of areas. And the first place where there was mention of sexual harassment was actually in the 1989 Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. And that came out of, in part, a Canadian representative to the governing board, Louise Caron. And I was able to find in my analysis how sexual harassment within the ILO was like an octopus, with one arm in health and safety, another arm in equal treatment. And the Anti-Discrimination Convention 111 becomes interpreted as the vehicle for fighting the sexual harassment as part of sex discrimination. And there are other arms in workplace conditions, promotion processes, and entrance into traditional male-dominated occupations. And yet there was study. And there was a feminist equality network at the ILO that throughout the 90s was pushing for the issue and had tripartite meetings and such. This is one of the members, Catherine Thomas. But the final timing really had a lot to do with the ILO feminists within the, had gained more prominent positions, the 21st century focus on the informal sector again and gender at work, the initiative on women's work as part of the centennial effort, the desire to pass a convention to mark its centennial and that would make a big splash, and the building momentum within the trade unions. I think that is absolutely crucial. And if you look at everything that happens in the period from 2009 to 2019, whether it's Public Services International, whether it's the International Transport Workers Federation, or the hotel and restaurant workers and the IUF, you see this building momentum in places as different as Bangkok and Bulgaria, as well as the IUF and the IFTU having concentrated campaigns, regional programs, as the IUF did in Asia Pacifica and Africa. For one example, an African regional women's project in 2007, aided by Swedish affiliates of the IUF, promoted slogans like "Make my workplace safe," "Dignity for hotel housekeepers." But the union also reached agreements with Chiquita, Unilever, Sodexo, and other international companies to tackle workplace sexual harassment. And in Latin America, the the union mobilized with women NGOs, for example. So I want to end with the topics that I raised at the beginning that I hope we can discuss: writing ILO histories, feminist labor history, and the dialectic of past and present. And first, I would say that ILO histories must count for gender, geography, and larger geopolitical forces, like the aftermath of empire and colonialism, shifting forms of global capitalism, as in the global supply chain with home-based labor, and expand outward, but also inward. The archive is essential, but here I want to have a cautionary that archives contain their own violences and omissions. What we find in them tells us much about governmentality in small and large ways. The archive is not God. And actually, I supplemented archives with oral interviews and participant observation in both cases. Much social movement and on-the-ground work is outside of archives. And so are the experiences of those who experience social death, who are objects, not persons, never mind ordinary people. And when the disenfranchised appear, they sometimes are re-traumatized through the words and actions of the makers of documents. And that's particularly seen in the portrayals of victimized workers. We must read not only against the grain, but along the bias, to borrow a garment-making metaphor from the historian Maria Fuentes, to breathe life or bear witness to those reduced to numbers or exploited, disembodied, disconnected labor. Such empathy is at the center of feminist labor history, for which the dialectic of past and present offers clues, but not necessarily answers, only more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for your very fascinating presentation, which, among many other very interesting things, I think it's also a strong statement for the importance of history in society. and the relations between memory and history. I really liked what you say, that memory is not enough. And I think it's a great motto for stating the necessity of historical investigations, of intelligent historical investigation, as you said. Now we can turn to Marica Tolomelli from the University of Bologna, who is going to share with us some ideas in relation to the issues raised by Susan and Eileen, and preparing the ground for the subsequent discussion. So, Marica, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi. Good evening to, or good morning to everyone here. And thank you, Valerio. Thank you, Eloisa, for organizing this meeting. We have heard two talks that are really full of inspiring thoughts and considerations. And I will start by shortly sum up some common points, some common issues concerning both contributions. And I will then formulate some questions with regard to each talk. The two contributions deal with the same actor, the ILO. At the center is at the center of this of the two relations. They both do consider this institution from beyond the institutional history of it. We are quite familiar with the conventional narrative on ILO as an institution, as a bureaucratic institution, mostly, and both relations do show that, in fact, we have to do with a very lively institution, that of course changes along the century. You cover the center of history. Susan started with at the very beginning of the grounding of the ILO, and Eileen considered the last decades of until nowadays, that's so to say. So both talks do address historical, political issues and methodological issues. And they addresses different historical contexts, but they share, in my opinion, a similar approach. In fact, both Susan and Eileen do stress the importance to focus on the intersection of different actors moving around ILO, or within ILO, or from outside ILO in different ways. So Susan, in her speech, she stressed how useful can be to move from a traditional approach that considered separately labor history, women's history, and ILO history in the interconnection. And the same did, although with regard to the changed context of recent time, Eileen with her talk, while stressing the stronger, the higher level in comparison to the period considered by Susan, the higher level of interconnections between different actors institutional actors and non-institutional actors. Eileen mentioned NGOs and groups, organizations acting outside of the arena, the institutional arena of the ILO. And I think this methodological approach is a good way to address, to reconsider the history of ILO, the history of how, from a feminist perspective, how women agency, women workers agencies in particular, in fact, impacted from the very beginning of the ILO history to recent time. What mostly struck me by Susan's talk is the fact that at the end, at the conclusion of the case that she describes, that brings to the Convention 26 in the 1920s, at the end of the 20s, is the fact that, yes, as she says, this was a compromise, equal pay for equal work, resulted as a principle that could be shared by the different actors participating in this process that led to the convention. On the otherwise, this was a base, this was a principle, a recognized principle that served as a term of legitimation for action, for further, for claiming further, or for claiming implementation of this principle in different contexts, and for nourishing a process of mobilization within women's activists. And I think this is very important because, in fact, Susan does stress the relevance of law, regardless of the implementation of law and principle. But once we have a law, we can address, we can call and we can claim the implementation of principles. And this we can see that the principle of equal pay for equal work does cross the whole 20th century, in fact, until recent time. The same, or not, it's not the same, but Eileen described how how difficult and complex it was to come to the Convention 177 in 1996, and she gave another example of how important it is to come to these results, perhaps yes, not completely satisfying in terms of the goals that are pursued, but they do mark steps that mark long processes, in fact. I wanted to address another, or to focus on another point that, in fact, does appear in both talks, the internationality of that ILO brings with. In fact, it is inside, it's an international organization, and the question is, which kind of internationality can we see from the beginning, from the foundation of the ILO in the 1919 to recent time? My impression is that when Susan speaks of internationality, she does cover a space, a spatial frame that is in fact focused on Europe, European activists, and in fact we have in the 20s to do with a still colonial order. So I would ask Susan to explicit this internationality. How far did women, the British women that addressed Thomas, Albert Thomas in the letter you mentioned, which women had they in their minds by claiming equal pay for equal work? And I think this, in the long-term history of ILO, we can see the decolonization process, globalization process at the same time. But if we consider the cases addressed by Eileen, we see how internationality changed, in fact, how it grew along the 20th century. Trade unions are the principal, the major actor involved in the history of ILO. It's in fact a labor organization, and it's evident that trade unions, international trade unions organization, federation, and so on, that you mentioned a lot of actors, unions, organizations. What I would like to stress, particularly with regard to Eileen talk, is the fact that she does consider a period after 1989, the end of Cold War, the period of crisis for left-wing parties, in Europe, as I would say, worldwide. And we see that issues claimed by workers, by women, I think we can observe how they continue to be represented in some way by trade unions, while political parties do lose a part of their capacity of representation, of implementation of principle of the political arena. So I would say it's an impression you can perhaps contend mine, but I think I have the impression that trade unions are really historical actors that have shown to be able to transform themselves, to follow and be part of transformations worldwide, while political parties have lost the capacity of represent workers' issues and women's issues. In the 1970s, political parties were the important player in the receiving and trying to implement issues coming from the women's liberation movement. And my impression is that in recent time nowadays, trade unions are the most influential actors on the international arena. Yes, you both gave a picture of ILO as a very lively institution, and I think this is due to the fact that you in fact focused on subjects, on actors that are normally let aside by institutional or conventional histories of ILO. So I think that the feminist perspective that you both used was very, does show, in fact, how useful it is to give a more complex view and inclusive view of the topics in this case you addressed, in this case the broad complex history of ILO, we can say. One remark to the issue of how to combine memory and archives. Eileen said the archives are not God. In fact, if you just consider archives, we find a certain kind of documentation of that can reproduce, that can in fact bring to a certain kind of narrative. Memory as well is not God. we know that very good. That so I think you combined, you mix these different kind of sources that in fact do show to be very effective in bringing a rich and inclusive view of the topic you addressed. I think I stop here, and we can perhaps begin with the debate.